If we could have our guest speakers, our featured speakers, as well as our faculty discussants come and have a seat up at the table. This is now your turn to think about, I'll have a seat here. Your turn to think about what inspired you, intrigued you, has you more curious, that you want to learn more about. And you can direct it towards an individual, or if you'd like to open a general question, that's fine as well. So I'm going to pass the mic over. I'll be the moderator, kind of point people out to answer questions, but I know we've got some folks with questions.
Do we stand up?
Yes, if you would stand so we can hear. And our panelists may need to pass the mic. So.
I think it's easy here in America for us to dismiss culture shock because it's pretty much everywhere you go. You can find somewhere where you're comfortable. The most culture shock I've had here is there's no sweet tea north of the Carolinas. So saying that, I really experienced culture shock when I visited my brother in Eastern Europe this past summer. And I didn't realize it was happening until he brought it up about a week later. And he said, have you been feeling frustrated or confused? I said, actually, I've been kind of, not angry isn't the right word, but just frustrated with everything. And, I couldn't explain it. And he said, that's part of culture shock, is that you don't understand what's going on, it's not normal to you. White noise in the background that we're used to here, such as the radio, TVs in a different language. And it kind of made sense to me at that point. Oh, wow, this is what culture shock is. And experiencing that for the first time, it kind of opened my eyes to the whole world. Dr. Dong, you said, how can you prepare a student and what to expect in culture shock? And after Dr. Pfeiffer spoke a little bit, it kind of answered some of this question. But what can I do to help future students that are experiencing culture shock that I take for granted every day, or that's not normal to them? I guess reading newspapers in other countries is great, but what else is there, I guess?
Well, I think it's a difficult question. So I defer first.
I happen to agree that it's a brilliant question. And as I said at the start of my talk, I've learned over the years that one only talks from their area of expertise, and your question falls outside of that. I really could offer some suggestions, but it really is outside of my area of expertise. But my sense is immersion is, that's sort of catch-all, but I think the more time I spend in a particular city, in a particular country, talking with local people and trying to learn the language, asking as many questions as I can, holding back my own judgment or opinion, the more likely I am to learn about how other individuals approach life and what's important to them. As Young Young said, I think for me the most poignant experience is when I went on sabbatical in Asia. So I was there for 4 months, and I made a commitment, a concerted commitment in going there, because I knew I was going to be frightened. I went by myself. I didn't know much about the culture. I was going to be living in an apartment by myself. I said, Steve, for at least 3 weeks, hold in abeyance any opinions you might have, because you're going to see a lot that's very different. So I really struggled, but for 3 weeks I just tried to take in as much as I could without making any judgment or evaluation, because I think we all do that. How is what we're seeing similar, dissimilar, and the more dissimilar our tendency is to be critical or negative. So I forced myself for a 3-week period not to be judgmental at all and just try to understand it. That was helpful because I fell in love with the Asian culture. And I think if I would have not waited, it would have been easier. And I hear a lot of people, when I came back, made sort of critical comments about Singapore. That's the place if you chew gum when you're caught, you're going to go to jail. And I would start getting defensive as if I was a Singaporean individual, because I had given myself enough time to embrace and really appreciate it's very different than Tallahassee or New York where I grew up, but it's also wonderful. So I think in addition to the immersion is holding back on judgment or evaluation until you have a semblance of a sense of how different people in different lands live and make sense of this world.
I was just going to add, in working with a number of clients who come from so many different countries, they can't go home that often. It costs tremendous amounts of money, and when they go, they have to go for a long period of time. I'm sure our panelists can talk about this also. But from my experiences, what I've learned from them is that to do so, they have to prepare for that. So that's part of the cultural immersion and the preparing for the travel. They're dealing with family issues that they haven't dealt with. They're going back to a culture that they've tried to assimilate into more American culture in order to function effectively in their communities, whether it's in school or in training opportunities. And they have families and children who are in the community and school systems. So I often hear about how difficult it is to go. It's tiring. They're shifting language focus and the way that they process all the time from the plane on, and just dealing with some of the family issues. And they're there long enough, sometimes 3 to 4 weeks if they're going because it costs so much money, that they get re-assimilated and then they have to do it again when they come back. So I think just the self-awareness that this happens for our clients, to help them be kinder to themselves, to understand they're probably going to be exhausted for a while, and that's a really big shift in terms of the way that they're thinking, the way they're processing, dealing with family issues that they might not be kind of addressing all the time. That's sort of what I have heard from my experience.
Another question? We'll go here. Kelly.
Eager-eyed, starry student here. Thanks for speaking with us. I'm curious what pieces of advice you could give us to use in the future when the gap that sometimes occurs between a multicultural client's viewpoint of therapy being really structured and maybe our approach, which is less so. What advice could you give us on kind of dealing with that?
This is our hot potato.
Well, another hard question. I think there's no easy answer to the questions. And I think it's really understanding your clients, what their background, and where they're coming from. I think it's very, very important. Kind of like reading back to Laura's questions in terms of how kind of like linked to your question is. I think it's for us as counselors, we need to understand what the cultural experiences of our clients. We need to take the step first. I remember when I first got to South Korea in 2002. My wife and I, we stayed there for 2 years. Although South Korea and China are all Asian countries, there's a lot different. So first of all, like eating, they all eat noodles. In China, we eat noodles. In South Korea, noodles. But the noodles is very, very different. And also, in China, the plate, if you go to a restaurant, you have plenty of choices. But in Korea, sometimes it's the culture. It's not that they cannot offer, but it's the culture. So when I first got there, I always feel hungry. I always feel hungry. And later on, I started to feel the benefit of being a little hungry, comparing with all my stomach feel. So with that being said, it's really how you put yourself in the food of your clients. First of all, I think it's to understanding how you, as a counselor, being open to cultural experiences. So that's my answer.
I don't know whether that is a good answer or not, but in terms of my experience, even in Korea, I have met a couple students from European countries, so I had to kind of switch my counseling styles to each different type of clients. So what I learned from those experiences was I need to feel free to be different. sometimes this is what I learned, so I need to do this way. Maybe we need to get out of that kind of concept. And maybe because these clients may have different characteristics, different culture, so we need to switch our gears to the different ways of counseling styles. So maybe try and error things. I did the same thing, a lot of errors with the Korean clients, even though I am Korean. So yeah, try to be different ways and feel free with that. That's, I guess.
Julia, you had a question?
Yeah. I think it's fascinating that someone in the Czech Republic might find Dr. Pfeiffer in Tallahassee, Florida, or that huge complex organization like the NIH would find Dr. Saunders in Durham, North Carolina. Where do those relationships start? How do you get, as an international, local consultant even, how do you get people to notice you?
You don't think about that intentionally, I don't think. It just happens, and you talk to people. I work with a lot of people who are trying to find employment, and from an international perspective, that's really challenging because you approach the job search very differently. So networking becomes this is such a social thing, and I can't do that, and I don't know how to talk about myself. So if you just think about what you share in common with other people, like I was sharing this woman who contacted me, and she said, we have this shared interest, and I do this work, and I see you do this. We need to talk about that. Somebody sent me an email last year, and they said, I was at a conference, and your name was brought up, and we have this shared interest, and you should talk to so-and-so in your area. They just got NIH funding to do this particular grant. So when you start talking to people about things that you share in common, it could lead to a job, but it could also lead to more of an understanding of what you do. And for me, that's sort of how I got connected to the opportunities that I have. So talk to people about what you do and what you share in common. I find this to be, it doesn't have to be a real formal thing. It can be very informal, and you learn a lot from other people. So I walk away from things going, I don't know if that'll be profitable for me or if that really leads to anything, but boy, that was really interesting.
I agree with that. In my own experience, it's networking. I don't have websites, but people who do get invited have wonderful websites, because people now scan websites. The other two are going to conferences, as faculty has encouraged. So even starting at the student level, presenting on a topic and staying within that sandbox, not bouncing around. So you develop an area of expertise because you've presented 3 or 4 or 5 times on that topic. People start recognizing your name, and the other is, if you can publish on that topic in that sandbox, people are going to read about you and say, Julia, you're doing something on career planning for pre-college students. Would you be interested? So I think the networking, presenting at conferences, publishing, and keeping your area pretty narrowly focused so you develop that expertise and people read about you and say, you're the kind of person we'd like to come meet with us within our organization.
Other questions? Yes.
So, Dr. Pfeiffer, you had some really interesting anecdotes about experiencing culture in other countries and maybe not knowing some of the behavioral norms that happen there. I think Dr. Lee spoke to this too, just in counseling. And I know that at the Career Center here, and I've worked also in Virginia and a couple other places, we have a lot of students that come through, not just for counseling, but just in general, who want to do business abroad and don't really know until they're in the middle of it whether or not they've crossed those cultural boundaries or made cultural faux pas. And I'm just curious if any of you have any particular resources or methods of research that you do ahead of time that help you to prepare to just get to know what some of those more general types of behavioral norms or things might be in those organizations, or
I'll just sort of reiterate what I said a few minutes ago. I've learned, because I've made faux pas and I've made mistakes, or when you don't get invited back for a second or third consultation, when you don't get a contract, that you need to do your upfront homework. So I'm going to the Czech Republic, and I've spent a lot of time reading about the Czech Republic, the history. I could tell you a lot about, communism and what it was like, and then how communism left. And I'm just trying to become as well versed as I can on that. But my area of expertise, they're bringing me in to look at gifted programs, gifted education in Czech Republic. So I spent a lot of time reading up on Europe and what's happening in Europe in gifted education and what's happening in the Czech Republic and in Austria, because they tend to follow what goes on in Austria. So it's doing a lot of homework. The caveat to that is I've found on occasion you can do a lot of prep work and you still only have a superficial understanding of the system that you're meeting with. And I think that's where I appreciate the counseling skills is not jumping in too quickly, assuming you know the client, even though you've done all that upfront work and you may know one or two people from the country that you've talked to, that you proceed slow. It's tricky, as all of you know, because it's just like counseling. The client in counseling wants something they can take home. They want some change, but they don't want you to jump too quickly in assuming that they understand their world. And that I find in consultation as well, is being able to give something of usefulness because they're paying for your service and you've traveled there, but not moving too quickly and assuming that you understand really the context and the nuances, because you don't. So it's proceeding somewhat slowly, even if you do your upfront homework.
Well, I guess whenever you go some different countries, or whenever you meet some people who come from different culture, maybe you are kind of a little anxious or a little uncomfortable, and at the same time you are kind of keep watching whether I'm behaving correctly or not, or something like that. But I guess before you have that kind of concern or anxiety, then I'd like to have you more like excitement, because you don't know about them. So that's what before we come over here, like in June, I have 2 boys, and they didn't want to come over here because they want to just spend the time with their friends, and if they come over here, they're not going to be to have many friends like they had in Korea or something like that. So they're worried about it. So what we did with our 2 boys was try to give them some excitement, because they're learning about new things. So I guess when you have some kind of like excitement rather than like worry about, I don't know about that. So just that's what I'm doing these days too. Because even though I have stayed here for 8 years, but now I feel like just new to in the United States, and so kind of like keep learning about the American culture, and that's really excitement. So I guess reading about their history, that is a great thing, but at the same time, excitement, that's a good one, I guess.
I really agree. I think sometimes I speak to myself, like the beauty of making mistakes. I often start my class, probably you know that I have, if you have attended my class, I have a talent. You know my talent, right? My talent is, if I speak your name, probably you will think that I'm calling someone else. But I really enjoy making mistakes, not enjoying. But in that process, I learn. I'm learning your name, I'm learning your culture, how the name comes. I think it's kind of like, as Dr. Pfeiffer mentioned, openness, being open to new experiences.
Someone else. Yes, Stacia.
Dr. Lee, you spoke of your first experience in counseling where with the supervisor you were able to see that you really had projected your values onto the client. Multicultural counseling is very important to me, and I found one of the hardest things is to realize those small instances where we, it's not the larger thing, but it's the small instances where we might be projecting our values onto the client. Do you all have any recommendations for things that we can do to really, create more awareness and kind of check in more with ourselves to keep track of that and to make sure that we aren't projecting our values onto the client in those smaller instances?
Well, maybe just learning about your culture. Because at first, actually, I didn't know what was my value. And even though I have grown up in South Korea, I never thought about what is my Korean culture, because I was just accustomed to it. I never thought about what is unique about Korean culture. So, and how that is different from others. So learning about my culture and my value will be the first step, because when you realize that what is your uniqueness, then you can see that the differences or aware the difference from your client. So I guess that's a kind of the first thing. And this one is a kind of, for example, right after I arrived in the United States, and it was 12 years ago, and I went to the Subway, and I had to order a sandwich. So I asked the person, I'd like to have a sandwich, and asked me, what kind of bread? What kind of bread? I asked the bread, different type of bread. And so I choose one bread, and American, provolone, Swiss. I'm Korean. So everything was about choice in the United States, but in Korea it was not. I just ordered the name of just one dish. So kind of like from that experience, oh yeah, Korean culture is different than the American culture in terms of like picking a choice or making a decision, and are very different. So understanding my culture would be the, I guess, the first one.
In thinking about situations with clients in counseling or psychotherapy, I think you are learning, and you have to trust that you're being trained well to create environments of openness, honesty, and trust. So in those kinds of environments, we're human, and we do cross bounds sometimes, and we make mistakes. And if you have developed that kind of relationship with your clients, they can point out things to you where you might have crossed the line, or you can come, I have sometimes gone home and said, oh, I maybe shouldn't have said that, that was kind of insensitive, I need to mention that in the next session. So I would come back then the next session and say, when we talked about, I felt like I might have said something that wasn't, maybe was offensive, or I didn't mean that, and you just bring those things up because there is that element of trust. Now, earlier in the relationship, that's harder to do, but you are learning to understand what your value system is and what might be trigger points for you. And there may be some situations where you're not feeling as comfortable working with particular clients because of issues that they're presenting. But that's a part of you learning your value system. But I think trusting the process and being willing to admit mistake and the fact that you're human too is really important.
I think we have time for one last question. Who's got a burning question? Adam, you've got a question.
Well, it actually draws off of that question that's kind of more directed towards Dr. Pfeiffer. You kind of talked about consultation in those moments where you make that kind of faux pas or consultation error where you're in their culture and you kind of make an assumption intro. Now, drawing off of that, you kind of give the example that you just kind of stopped talking and moved on. Was there anything you did as kind of a corrective thing, not just like remembering that and trying to be proactive next time to not make that mistake? Is there anything you did in response?
If I understand your question, I may not, so interrupt me. I think what I found is relying on, again, those important basic counseling skills that we were all trained in, that we're continually sort of living by, become part of us. So I think being self-effacing, acknowledging and admitting I messed up, I'm sorry, asking for feedback. I probably shouldn't have done that. You know, how is it done here, whatever it might be. And what I'm saying is, because I don't do cross-cultural or multicultural counseling, but I do consultation, but it probably applies in counseling as well. So asking the client, you know, I sort of messed up. Recognizing that that's still a Western approach, and the client may be reluctant to share with you right away that, and they might not say anything, and appreciating that that's okay, that you're just sharing. I recognized I made a blunder. You know, if at some later point you want to mention to me how I messed up, I'd be delighted to hear. So I think going into it that way, humility, being humble, recognizing there's so much we don't know in our own work, and then when we go to work in a different culture, it's magnified tremendously. So I think those kind of counseling attitudes serve us well. And the other is the enthusiasm, that we're here to help. When I do these consultations, when I'm going to Czech Republic, I'm really excited because I'm hoping that there's some opportunity to impact the lives of bright kids in the Czech Republic. And I may make some mistakes along the way because I'm going to a very different culture, a different world. But if I'm conveying my enthusiasm that I'm here because I'm excited about the opportunity of perhaps working with you and affecting the lives of kids, I think most well-intentioned people from different cultures recognize that and are forgiving as we make those kind of mistakes. The other thing I would add, and it relates to the last question, is, and you've all heard this in counseling training, is having a colleague with more experience who you can trust and consult with. So when you mess up, or you think you messed up, or you think that the interaction didn't go well, speaking with someone who can give you an objective, valid feedback about that is really helpful. I find in my work, I try to, because I do a fair amount of this now, connect with someone who is embedded within that culture, living there, typically an American, that I can be very honest with and say, I'm going to, wherever it might be, Italy or France, what should I expect? You know, what do I need to do different? So the more you can get that ahead of time, but as you make mistakes, talk to that person. And I was able to do that. One of my close colleagues lives in Asia, Maureen Nehart. She's done a lot of work in the gifted, but she's been there 20 years. So she's pretty embedded within that culture. So I rely a lot on her when I mess up and say, Mo, what did I do wrong? And she'll say, Steve, you blew it. You should have done this. And you recognize that and move forward.
Would you join me in thanking our speakers?